Good afternoon. It's a distinct honor and pleasure to be able to introduce the Richard Cohen lecture, second lecture in this series this year, and it's the newest of the lecture series at the Hutchins Center. I'm the Assistant Professor of History of Art and Architecture and African American Studies here at Harvard. And I'm thrilled to be able to listen to the work of my colleague, Kobena Mercer. The lecture today is entitled Afro-Modernism's Musée Imaginaire. Kobena Mercer is the Professor of History of Art and African American Studies at Yale, where he brings methods from cultural studies to his teaching and research on modern and contemporary Black Atlantic world studies. As Carrie Lambert Beatty put it yesterday, he's won all the prizes, including the inaugural Clark Prize for Excellence in Arts Writing, awarded by the Sterling and Francine Clark Art Institute in 2006. Now, given how prolific he is, I could cite the path-breaking interventions from many of his books and essays, but instead I'd like to focus on a recent publication, Travel and See. In the introduction to this collection of analytic pieces written between 1992 and 2012, you get a sense of the breadth of his practice, examining the works of artists such as John Akomfrah, Renee Green, Isaac Julian, Kerry James Marshall, among others. And in it, he tacitly argues for the centrality of the Black diaspora as a requisite for understanding contemporary art, not the other way around. This is a rarely asked question, and one that Kobena Mercer puts at the heart of his work. Can one fully understand modern and contemporary art without studying the Black diaspora? Attention to race and art history often restricts a discussion of aesthetics, Kobena Mercer has observed, and this tends to rob globally diverse Black art of its dialogical power. He also argues that Black artistic practices have irrevocably shaped our entire sense of, quote, as he puts it, what art actively does as it enters into the circulatory networks of public life, end quote. His book, Travel and See, assesses the wide-ranging effects of what he calls, quote, the interrupted agency of Blackness, in uncovering the, quote, interdependence buried at the foundations of modern discourse of aesthetics, of the modern discourse of aesthetics, end quote. Now, in yesterday's introduction, Henry Louis Gates Jr. explained that his time at Yale shaped his understanding of the field of African American studies and African diasporic studies. And he saluted the Yale professor, Robert Ferris Thompson, for much of this work. I went to Yale University for my doctorate, and I am, in fact, Robert Ferris Thompson's final student. He turned 90 2 months ago. It's fitting, I think, that given this, that we have in Kobena Mercer a scholar who salutes the path-breaking work of Robert Ferris Thompson's practice. Thompson is, of course, known for charting the influence of African culture on art in the Americas, and who coined the terms Black Atlantic and Afro-Modernism, a term that's in the title of today's talk. Mercer speaks in a way that has Thompson's spirit as he advocated a, quote, retelling of modernism to show how it reveals that the other is your neighbor, that Black and modernist cultures were inseparable long ago, end quote. This is an important theoretical inclusion, offering what amounts to an homage to Thompson's visionary perspective and charting a new course of scholarship that we are grateful to have received from Kobena Mercer. Before coming to Yale, Kobena was an independent scholar, a term that I love as it speaks to the singularity of his mind. He is the best kind of independent thinker, because from him we have texts that offer us new paradigms through which to create and reconstitute the field. We've done so through reading his historical studies on Mary Bearden and James Vandersea, and his texts that he's put together as editor of the Annotating Art History series, which include titles from Cosmopolitan Modernisms to Exiles, Diasporas, and Strangers. We've learned from him through his essays and exhibition catalogs, including the one that will be in the forthcoming reader on Adrian Piper, published by the Museum of Modern Art this year. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to today's speaker, Kobena Mercer.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. And thanks, Sarah, so much for that wonderful introduction. I said yesterday about the warm welcome my work's received in African American Studies departments, and it's quite incredible for me to think that I've been at Yale for almost 7 years. So to be welcomed into an academic community that included Sarah Lewis, Robert Farris Thompson, Elizabeth Alexander, and so many other of my colleagues has been something for which I'm incredibly grateful, and something for which I could not really have foreseen 10, 20, 30 years ago. So I look forward to the adventure continuing. So my title this afternoon is Afro-Modernism's Musée, Imaginaire. In 1940, Locke published an art book, The Negro in Art, a pictorial record of the Negro artist and of the Negro theme in art. The book is important because it's the culmination of Locke's visual arts writings. It marks the point at which Locke's interest in African art that catalyzed his transformation into a public intellectual in the 1920s and which grew in the 1930s with the shift of his focus to black folk culture's contribution to American culture, was summed up in a world-minded perspective. The Negro in Art sets the achievements of 20th century black artists in the deep historical context of representations of blackness in Western art history as a whole. It's a book that's magisterial in scope. It spans vast swathes of time in a picture book that was designed to make its narrative broadly accessible. After all, it was published by the Associates of Negro Folk Education, which really was essentially Locke himself. But the story it tells is not just art historical, it's civilizational, for it reveals black images weaving in and out of a worldwide narrative that stretches from the Quattrocento to mid-20th century modernism. Yet, because our received image of Locke tends to focus on his 1920s art writings, which we looked at yesterday, it's perhaps unsurprising that the Negro in art has been overlooked. But is that also because it's a picture book, conducting its argument through the photo reproductions that Locke selected, sequenced, and laid out on the printed page? A logocentric culture that thinks words get us closer to the truth than images might be part of the problem, although art historians who say that artworks possess an intelligence of their own have not exactly rushed to defend the art historical reasoning that Locke put forward in The Negro in Art. Where are we? So Locke chose Sergeant Johnson's chalk on paper drawing, Mother and Child, of 1932, as the book's frontispiece, and the dedication to his mother, quote, in gratitude for a sense of beauty that included our racial own, speaks not only to the personal importance of this book that it held for Locke among his many publications, but it also recapitulates the point made in The Legacy that, quote, all vital art discovers beauty and opens our eyes to that which we previously could not see. But if we turn our attention to the contents page and we see this three-part structure in the book's overall organization, are we looking at a dialectical scheme? The self-representation in the book's first section, The Negro as Artist, Part 1, is followed by a second, The Negro in Art, which consists of depictions of blacks in European art history. But if the two relate as thesis and antithesis, why, in the place of the supposedly resolving synthesis, do we find in the third section on the ancestral arts, tribal artifacts paired with modernist art from Europe? Why did Locke put Africa at the end of the story in the same place as the modern? If Africa is the place of origin that makes the American Negro distinctive, why is it not at the beginning? Locke was no dialectician. He left that role to Du Bois, whose Hegelianism was apparent from the start. So we may not be dealing with a dialectic, but in the presence of this three-part structure, we are nonetheless dealing with the dialogic. And it's this dialogic aspect of Locke's cross-cultural methods that I'm exploring today. So produced during the 1939-1942 conjuncture that marked a historic turning point for Afro-America, The Negro in Art is at once an art historical pendant to the 1939 exhibition Contemporary Negro Art that Locke co-curated at Baltimore Museum of Art. And it's also a counterpart to his anthology of 1942, When Peoples Meet, a study in race and culture contacts, which was a social science anthology co-edited with Columbia University lecturer Bernard Stearns. So my argument in this lecture is that when we situate the three-part structure of the Negro in art in the broader intellectual context of Locke's core commitment to the cross-cultural, we begin to see how the concept of contact that was first addressed in 1916 in his Howard lectures on race contacts and interracial relations, which then got rephrased by the verb contribution in his cultural criticism of the 1930s, actually culminates in the notion of intercultural reciprocity that was put forward in When Peoples Meet. Understanding culture as a composite formation was not just rehearsed in the Negro in Art's tripartite editorial structure, but the intelligence with which Locke curated the page instantiates a critical black pluralism that he articulated from the pragmatist precepts that carry plenty of implications for world-minded ways of writing Afro-diaspora art histories today. And I acknowledge that critical black pluralism is Jeffrey Stewart's valuable formulation. And alongside Stewart's pioneering work as a Locke scholar, it's really the most succinct and best fitting description of Locke's outlook as a pragmatist who always put his ideas into action. So first of all, we need to understand why Locke used the term Negro art as a category that was inclusive of white and black artists alike. To our contemporary ears, that sounds unusual or counterintuitive, to say the least. In a culture of atomistic individualism, the prevalence of identity-based reasoning tends to think of identity in proprietorial terms as something that you own, an attribute that belongs to you, whereas Locke thought of culture as a commons, a composite body of materials capable of being pushed and pulled into multiple semantic directions. In his 1939 article, The Negro's Contribution to American Culture, he explained his move away from identitarian and author-centric reasoning when he said the following: "It seems reasonable to maintain that tracing an arbitrary strand of Negro authorship and narrowly construed race productivity not only does not do the Negro group cultural justice, but it does not disclose the cultural exchanges and interactions that are vital to the process." So distinguishing culture as process from culture as products is one of Locke's philosophical anchoring points, and it's one that we'll come back to. For now, what we need to hear is the anti-proprietorial approach that he was formulating in 1939. In that essay, the question that he was grappling with, quote, of the propriety of applying race concepts to cultural products, for example, what makes a work of art Negro, its theme or its idiom, what constitutes a Negro contribution to culture, its authorship or its cultural base. These are precisely delineations of the problem space that Locke answered with his concept of intercultural reciprocity. And the key feature that we need to pick out from that quote is the pairing of theme and idiom. We heard these terms already in Legacy of 1925 when he said that, quote, "Any vital artistic expression of the Negro theme and subject in art must break through the stereotypes into a new style, a distinctive fresh technique and some sort of characteristic idiom." I'm going to move this so that I can enjoy the benefits of it. He said, "Any vital artistic expression of the Negro theme must break through the stereotypes to a new style, a distinctive fresh technique, and some sort of characteristic idiom." But what we need to know is that the theme-idiom couplet is drawn from linguistics, with idiom concerning social accentuation and expressive inflection, those aspects of discourse that reveal a speaker's enunciative positioning. I think this is creating a sort of blowback situation. Okay, so theme, idiom comes from linguistics. Idiom concerns social accentuation and expressive inflection. In other words, those aspects of a discourse that reveal a speaker's enunciative positioning, where the discourse is coming from, more so than the content of the speech itself. So whereas black subject matter or the Negro theme had been addressed in Locke's understanding by black and white artists alike, he gave priority to idiom by placing 210 images in the book's first section, which covers African American art from Joshua Johnston in the 1700s to Jacob Lawrence and others in the post-Harlem Renaissance era of the 1930s. And that was placed ahead of the 190 plates in the book's second section that showed images of blacks produced by Western artists from the 13th century Italian Renaissance onward. So what Locke achieves with the pairing of theme and idiom is an understanding of art as a cultural practice that is structured like a language. Instead of thinking of art in biographical or individualistic terms as self-expression, and instead of asking whether black artists are producing more accurate representations of the Negro theme than white artists, the theme-idiom framework points to dialogic relations in a cross-cultural field of artistic production that forms the very ground on which art history matters, not just to specialist art historians, but to the public at large, so the public for which he created his picture book. So the story that Locke is telling in The Negro in Art is not a vindicationist one, in which the achievements of black artists are being supplemented by the comparative presence of black images in Western art history. Rather, it is a world art history, addressing the moves made by players in a game of give and take in intercultural reciprocity, that reveals in turn that Locke is implicitly arguing, reveals something about the genesis of civilization itself. However, these deep stakes that Locke invested in art history seem to have passed us by. When James Porter, who was the head of art at Howard University and the author of Modern Negro Art in 1943, which was the first dedicated study establishing the field of African American art history as such, he attacked Locke. And he had done this in his 1937 Art Front Review that was critical of Negro art past and present, which was the first of the bronze booklets. And Porter's contention was a valid one. Porter argued that starting the historiography with African art was mistaken because it ignored the craft production by skilled artisans under slavery, which was the true origin of a distinctive tradition, hence the right place for a narrative to begin. The validity of Porter's argument, which established the study of material culture in colonial America as the starting point of the field, did not, however, preclude his utter misrecognition of Locke's intellectual aims. Porter's polemical view that, quote, Dr. Locke has yielded to the insistence of the segregationist that differences between black and white are so general that they cannot be defined, so particular that they cannot be reduced through rational investigation, end quote.
Where was Porter writing that?
This was in his book Modern Negro Art of 1943. And in saying that, he completely failed to recognize the core principle that informed Locke's conception of Negro art as inclusive of white and black artists, which was a relational principle that Locke had derived from his Harvard philosophy tutor, Josiah Royce, namely that cultural differences are always differences of degree rather than differences of kind. And that's a key principle that we could restate by saying that ethnicities are never absolute or self-contained, but only acquire identity as a result of their constant self-differentiation within a commons from one another on the terrain of culture. So the 1939 Baltimore Contemporary Negro Art Exhibition marked a turning point that had contradictory outcomes for Locke's standing as a public intellectual. As we see Richmond Barthé with his stevedore statuette of 1937 and Jacob Lawrence, a mere 24 years old, with his Life of Toussaint Louverture series of 1938, entrusting their work to a museum registrar, we see a glimpse of the era-defining shift whereby Lawrence, having been taught by black instructors such as Augusta Savage and Charles Alston, made his stylistic choices entirely within a peer-to-peer environment, the environment that Alston created as a federal arts supervisor. This was Studio 306 at 141st Street. And this was completely unlike the paternalistic patronage that Barthé and others had experienced in the 1920s, when the philanthropic Harman Foundation was really the principal art patron and hence gatekeeper of black access into the field of artistic production. So post-Harlem Renaissance artists distanced themselves from Locke's ancestralism. At the 1936 American Artists Congress, that was organized by Stuart Davis, Aaron Douglas looked back on the 1920s, wryly commenting that, quote, when unsuspected Negroes were found with a brush in their hand, they were immediately hauled away and held for interpretation, end quote. That's clearly measuring his distance from Locke of the 1920s. But under the changing conditions of the 1940s, it would be mistaken for us to assume that Africa and all things Africana had simply been abandoned. The 1939 Baltimore exhibition included sculptures by the London-based, Jamaican-born Ronald Moody. The two children are looking up at Midons of 1937, which is one of Moody's self-invented mythological figures. And this marks the point at which Afro-Modernism in the late 1930s became a self-consciously transnational movement, flowing from Harlem Mecca, to abbreviate the survey graphic title, into the Caribbean locale that included such mid-century modernists as Wilfredo Lam, who shuttled between Havana and Paris, or Edna Manley in Jamaica. So the inclusion of artists from the Caribbean is an important post-Harlem Renaissance development we need to take account of. Moreover, Africanisms were alive and well in 1940s Afro-Modernism, but not as a classical objet d'art in the manner that African art had been framed in the 1920s, but more as elements of an Africanist vernacular that had come to distinguish the understanding of American Negro folk culture. Quote, to try and carry on in America where African sculpture left off would be to start on a false basis, wrote Romare Bearden to his friend, the painter Walter Quirt in 1942. The gap of the years, the environment, and the ideology is too great. Scholars who misread Bearden as rejecting Locke's ancestralism, as if in Newtonian terms every action begets an equal and opposite reaction, are scholars who fail to notice what the art is actually showing us. In The Family, for example, on your left, of 1941, Bearden's vernacular realism massively enlarges the man's hands, pointing to the meager provisions on the table, even as his upraised left makes a protective gesture, as if to bar a bailiff from entering his home. Fully in keeping with such expressive stylization, Africanist traces are also present in the volumetric mass that forms the cubic bulk of the man's head and neck. And similarly, with a protruding mouth and broad nose, Alston's carved head of 1937 is similarly imbued with Africanisms by virtue of the earthy, raw solidity in this sculpture that contrasts with the much more picturesque handling of folk culture subject matter in a work such as Richmond Barthé's Blackberry Woman of 1932. So yes, it's true that in contrast to Locke's 1920s enthusiasm for the Afro-Deco aesthetic that Aaron Douglas shared in common with Auguste Mambour, who was really a minor Belgian artist to whom Locke devoted an entire article. It's true that Locke had less of a feel for what African-American modernists were doing in the 1940s as they turned towards the black vernacular and its folk art sources. Stylistic turn of the kind that we see in William Henry Johnson's Children of 1941 on the right, whose figures carry an expressive power with a bare minimum of line, color, and shape that calls to mind the drawings of the untutored artist Bill Traylor that were discovered and exhibited in this same moment, 1939, 1942. So at a time when black artists of the 1940s stepped aside from high-low boundaries so as to be able to investigate the common culture of the African-American vernacular, we come up against what many scholars discern as the residual high culture elitism of Locke's approach to folk materials. And I suggest that the problem of Locke's attachment to high-low boundaries, which is certainly a feature of his cultural criticism, is one that we can best clarify with close attention to the Negro in art's overall methodology. So to situate this in context, in his two 1936 bronze booklets, he published Negro Art Past and Present and The Negro and His Music in the same year. Locke divided black cultural history essentially into two broad periods, under slavery and since emancipation. So where in The Negro in Art, in its first section, outlines a chronology in which artists move from the position of an apprentice, he periodizes this to circa 1850, 1870, through to the position of a journeyman of 1880 towards 1910, and then finally to master from 1920s onwards. That previous two-part diachronic distinction, work produced under slavery and since emancipation, is all important. Unlike 19th century artists who mostly avoided the Negro theme, Negro subject matter, 1920s New Negro artists achieved the historical breakthrough of being the first generation to choose black life as their primary subject matter. And in 1936, Locke had put forward stylistic differentiations, traditionalist, modernist, and Africanist, that underscored the diverse aesthetic options that had arisen since the 1920s, the options that had arisen since black culture was chosen as the primary content or subject matter amongst African American artists. So if we think of Nancy Elizabeth Prophet's Negro Head, circa 1927, as Africanist, what we do is pay attention to the figure's forward-looking countenance and the sense in which it embodies a forthright sense of pride. And we might say that in contrast, Laura Wheeler Waring's portrait is traditionalist in the sense that she belongs to what Locke called the conservative wing of our Negro artists, end quote. Even though we might qualify that distinction by saying that the gentle brushwork that surrounds her portrayal of Anna Washington Derry has post-impressionist qualities as well. Aaron Douglas, in my view, best encapsulates what Locke had in mind as modernist with the color-graded layering we see in Into Bondage of 1936, highlighting the idiom, that unique stylistic aesthetic that Richard Powell has crisply named for us as Afro-Deco. Although, again, to qualify matters, we should note that modernists for Locke also included artists as stylistically diverse as Archibald Motley, Malvin Johnson, whose work we looked at yesterday, William Henry Johnson, and James Lecesne Wells. So if this brief excursus indicates that Locke's stylistic differentiations are still serviceable, it should also be observed that with such degrees of overlap, his threefold stylistic distinction was not seeking to lock down a final ekphrasis, but to show through such stylistic branchings the plural directions into which new Negro identities had flourished since the 20s and in which they were continuing to grow. So likewise, the Negro as artist section, and we're looking here at pages that feature work by Archibald Motley on the left and Palmer Hayden on the right. This section does not set out to definitively categorize the flow of choices that had been made since the 1920s. For when we recall that in his 1925 legacy essay, Locke wanted to see a racially representative school or movement, what we see in a layout such as this, bringing Motley's nightlife scenes together with a still life and landscape by Hayden, is an anti-monolithic view of the black self-representation that African-American artists had achieved once black subject matter had become their principal theme. So if art is not primarily biographical self-expression for Locke, so much as the aesthetic inscription of shared values that bind a social group into a collective identity, then what such diverse idioms reveal is a pluralistic blackness. And I state the matter with this emphasis because I'm pushing against two prevalent tendencies that tend, in my opinion, to flatten the complexities of Locke's thinking as a critical black pluralist. One such tendency concerns the way his pluralism undermines racialized dichotomies of universal and particular, a problem that has in fact haunted the field of African American art history from the start. But secondly, and perhaps even more problematic, is the tendency whereby the scholarly focus on Locke's high culture elitism actually ends up blocking our ability to recognize the operational centrality of the cross-cultural in his methods as a cultural critic and in his overall philosophy of culture. So I want to tackle each of these problems in turn. For the art historian Mary Ann Calo, who's dedicated an entire study to Locke's mid-20th century writings, his shift of focus in the 1930s from African art to black folk culture and its contributions to American national culture entailed what she sees as a developmentalist narrative in which vernacular raw materials were to be self-consciously stylized and thereby refined into formal art in the realm of high culture. And one can concede that in music and literature, Locke does indeed discern a chronological pattern through the lens of theme and idiom. Whenever he stresses historical sequences in which, for example, spoken dialect and folk tales come to be refined and formalized into poetry and novels, just as in The Negro and His Music of 1936, he gives an account of how slave work songs and spirituals were the common root from which ragtime, blues, and jazz arose, further developing in the 1930s with the orchestral symphonies composed by William Grant Still. In the realm of music studies, in his book Deep River, Music and Memory in the Harlem Renaissance, Paul Anderson argues that where Locke valued folk expression in its pure form, just as he valued the European classical tradition, because what he disdained was the commercial output of Tin Pan Alley in the middlebrow realm. Alain Anderson notes for us that Locke consistently used the metaphor of black folk elements as musical ore. He quotes from The Negro and His Music, quote, "Only when pure and in the form originally used by the people for themselves do folk elements yield us true folk music. This is why real folk music is rare, but it's the most precious musical ore that we have." And in Anderson's interpretation, this fits full square with a kind of developmentalist sequence, a developmentalist pattern, a logic of sublimation in which raw material is not simply refined, but is heated and cooked. It's sublimated into something of formal beauty in the high cultural sense. However, the sticky point with reading Locke primarily as offering a developmentalist narrative is that his avowed investment in high culture is too often conflated with the view that he was motivated by a craving for approval from upper-class whites as something that would somehow legitimate black cultural production. And picking up from James Porter, this is exactly the conclusion that Mary Ann Kello heads towards when she argues that in the visual arts, Locke, quote, sought to encourage a willful transformation of folk idioms into folk art, end quote. Yet, in her view, because he ignored material culture under slavery, he was of no help to black artists. For, quote, in the absence of a demonstrable organic evolution from folk to modern fine art, Locke left many professional African-American artists suspended between these two paradigms. However, when we take a glance at the second section of the Negro in Art book of 1940, while thinking about Locke's editorial decisions in demarcating the art historical ground covered by the book as a whole, I think we begin to see matters in a slightly different light. So Ekins's sympathetic portrait of Tanner, like Eastman Johnson's sketches and studies, all serve to qualify the view we heard yesterday when Locke was critical of black images in American art history as being solely a matter of, quote, caricature and genre. But in the second section as a whole, which starts with 14th century images of the black Magi in Italian Renaissance art, Gruneval's portrayal of the black Saint Maurice alongside Dürer's 1521 sketch of a black woman, we begin to notice that Locke is not legitimating modern black visual art by placing it next to depictions of blacks in European art history, but that what he's doing is expanding the hermeneutic context by introducing a comparative dimension. By inviting us to compare and contrast the way blackness has been seen through Western eyes, after we have first seen how blackness has been seen by black artists themselves, we realize that far from seeking to elevate what black artists have achieved, Locke is dismantling the racialized dichotomy between the universal and the particular by laying out a horizontal cross-cultural continuum. With his dissertation on the theory of value that was touched on yesterday, Locke's view that value is not an intrinsic attribute but an outcome of historically variable acts of valuation, implies that no artwork can be automatically universal in its aesthetic value. It only becomes so, it only acquires universality through acts of valuation, which in turn implies that black art and culture is itself never inherently particularistic, but stands itself to acquire universal value, just as black music has been universalized in American national culture, when its aesthetic evaluation is placed on a world historical continuum rather than a self-contained space that separates African American artists from others. So we can come at this in another way. Have you ever thought about why it is that in Locke's art writings, we never come across the phrase positive and negative images? That's because his focus on idiomatic differentiation on a common theme directs our attention to style, not as the outpouring of individual self-expression, but as the index of the collective mentality of the age in which each artwork was produced. Locke's premise that the products of culture cannot be thought of in proprietorial terms once we realize how modern life accelerates and exacerbates processes of cross-cultural contact leads to a conclusion we could never arrive at if we only focus on his elitism as a manifestation of a sensibility that is so at odds with our own age. Coming at things from the point of view of culture as a process, what we gain in thinking of art and culture as structured like a language, with black and white voices speaking on common themes in an endlessly differentiated and variable set of idioms, is a pan-medium method capable of crossing visual art, music, and literature with the ultimate aim of being able to explain how different mentalities, different subjectivities, different identities arise within the cultural commons. So instead of culture as a second-order phenomenon that's reflecting identities that are already there, culture is all important for Locke as a first-order phenomenon that encompasses the entire terrain in which new identities enter history, the terrain in which existing identities may also be opened up to possibilities of self-transvaluation. So let's think about what's at stake in the following way. If we were to reverse the editorial sequencing in the Negro in art and start in chronological order, so that we'd have, for instance, Velázquez's 1640 portrait of Juan de Pajera, the Spanish artist's mulatto studio assistant, who was also a painter in his own right, and then follow it by Gulfstream or After the Tornado by the American artist Winslow Homer, and come up to date with Jacob Lawrence's Two Saints series of 1938, we would instantly see that the ground Locke is covering is that which in our own time has been mapped by the by the image of the black in Western art, the multi-volume series initiated by Dominique de Menel in the 1960s, and his first volume was published in 1979. And the interesting thing here is that the sheer quantity of Western art historical material in volumes 1 to 4 of the image in the black in Western art far outweighs the relatively short 20th century time span in which black artists brought new accents, new idioms, new ways of seeing into the narrative in volume 5. So what we immediately become aware of are the David and Goliath proportions of this asymmetrical ratio. And that's telling us something important about cross-cultural contact, something that Locke intuited in the editorial structure of his 1940 picture book. It's an intuition that before it mattered to black people, blackness mattered immensely to white Western identities. Using our language, not Locke's, we would say that the symbolic otherness of the black image made it a meaningful difference that became indispensable to the cultural construction of whiteness in the history of the modern West. Now, imposing our vocabulary in this way is anachronistic, it's unacceptable. It amounts to a form of presentism that judges the past according to our contemporary values. And all of that disavows the historically specific conditions under which Locke was acting and thinking. But nonetheless, where the leading figures in Locke scholarship, Geoffrey Stewart, Leonard Harris, Charles Molesworth, amongst others, have discerned an anticipation of a constructionist outlook in his philosophy of culture, I'd like to suggest that attention to the pragmatist precepts guiding Locke's cultural criticism brings to light not simply a proto-constructionist, but a proto-discursive constructionism in which the linguistic-influenced work of the anthropologist Franz Boas features significantly. So I'm now going into sort of backstory as we think about how it is that Locke came to conceptualize theme and idiom on the basis of some of Boas's ideas. In 1911, Locke and Du Bois alike attended the Universal Racist Congress in London, at which Boas famously presented his paper, The Instability of Racial Types. Famously, I say, because as Boas demonstrated that variations of traits within a demographic group occur as often, if not more, as differences between one group and another, he demolished biological determinism and he discredited scientific claims surrounding the concept of race. So Du Bois continued to wrestle with the authority of the life sciences, but in the first of the 5 lectures that Locke presented at Howard in 1916, he's 31 years of age, he moved swiftly from demystifying what he called blood race, that was in lecture 1, to then in lecture 2 giving a historical account of what he called social race. Having dismantled the theoretical and scientific conception of race, he covered ground from the Roman Empire to the British Empire in his 2nd and 3rd lectures that addressed the political and practical conception of race, arguing that racial categories which have no meaning or value in themselves are products of political domination. Or, as he put it quite trenchantly in 1916, quote, "The concept of inferior races or superior races largely comes from political fortunes and political capacities of peoples. The people who have not been successful in acquiring dominance will be called the inferior people. The ruling people not only dominate the group practically, but control the class distinctions justifying their success in terms of innate forms. It behooves us then to assume humbly that such notions as superiority refer only to the political fortunes of a group and not to any intrinsic or inherent qualities with respect to social culture," end quote. So he understood that just as racial traits such as skin color lack innate meaning, yet serve to categorize social groups, his social culture concept addressed the role that the products of culture play in creating solidarity and collective identity. Locke was mindful of the Celtic revival in turn-of-the-century Ireland and of the rediscovery of peasant folk culture in the national literatures of Poland and other Slavic Eastern European nations prior to World War II. And he transposed the solidarity-creating role of culture intra-nationally to the United States, where alongside Du Bois, he trenchantly opposed assimilation. In Du Bois's view, put forward against the idea of assimilation in his 1897 Conservation of Races essay, each of the 7 races would conserve their distinctiveness by virtue of an innate gift or essence that they would bring to humankind. Yet for Locke, the pragmatist, the anti-biologism of Boas's critique was inflected with a pragmatist spin. These are the words of Nancy Fraser, who examines the 1916 lectures in her contribution to Leonard Harris's 1999 essay collection, The Critical Pragmatism of Alain Locke. As Nancy Fraser summarizes, quote, "The crucial point was not simply that race relations are not physically determined, but they are also not definitively fixed. Essentially historical and dynamic, the product of social interaction, relations can be changed by deliberate human action. And insofar as culture names the terrain on which relations can be changed by deliberate human action, what Locke anticipated in 1916, when he phrased the concept of a bid for culture citizenship, was a process that got underway 9 years later with the 1924 Civic Club dinner that is widely understood to have paved the way for the cultural ferment of the Harlem Renaissance as a whole. So I'll further tease out other implications of these important lectures of 1916 in tomorrow's lecture. Suffice at this stage to say that the radical upshot of Locke's pragmatist thinking undermines the presumption that he was an apolitical aesthete whose love of beauty went hand in hand with an aversion to political conflict. As we come back to the theme idiom couplet in his writings on art and cultural history, which conceives of culture in terms of multiple voices engaging common themes with different accents, I want to insert Stuart Hall's remarks on Boas's 1910 book, Race, Culture and Language. This is from Hall's 1983 lectures on cultural studies, for it pinpoints what's at stake in thinking of art and culture as structured like a language. So these are Hall's words about Boas. Boas always insisted that if you're going to study a particular people, you have to understand their language, because their language is the primary symbolic system they use to give their social reality an intelligible form. Language, in this sense, is an imposition of intelligibility on the world. The world has to be made meaningful, and this can only be accomplished by breaking it up, by giving names to the various bits, and by establishing relationships amongst them. Now, Locke himself would never have used a phrase such as primary symbolic system, but insofar as idiom was his word of choice, the overarching concern of his cultural criticism was to investigate how a distinctively American Negro way of seeing, of making the world intelligible from a new Negro point of view, would contribute not just to solidarity on the part of those who had been subordinated to the dominance of race, but would also contribute to the transvaluation of America's self-perception as a nation. Now, objections to Locke's lack of attention to material inequalities of race are legion, and there are no shortage of logical flaws and inconsistencies in the idealist tendencies of his very ambitious thinking. But if art and culture are like language games, then transformation, it logically follows, comes about not as a result of heroic genius on the part of individual artists, but as a result of critical moves made by players in a game, moves that modify the rules of the game, that change the terms of the conversation. So is this discursive conception of culture not where Locke was headed with his early uptake and far-sighted extrapolation from Boas's view of language as making the world intelligible? So to come back to the Negro in art, we've yet to explain why it is that Africa is found at the end and not the beginning. Although I hope that through this brief detour, through Locke's thinking as a pragmatist, we've got some clues. If Africa were the name of a deterministic origin, designating the spiritual message that a particular race were bringing to humankind, it would certainly be at the start of the story, even though there would actually be no story to tell, for the cultural forms produced by such a group would have been teleologically predetermined in advance. Likewise, if art history is to be told as a story of organic evolution, those were Mary Ann Calo's terms, then the premise of unbroken continuity built into such an evolutionist or developmentalist model would require that Africa should be the originary source from which African-American art begins. But Locke was inviting us into a very different epistemological space, a space of diaspora where the ruptures and breaks brought about by the fortunes, the political fortunes of historical contingency, puts the whole question of origins and originality into an entirely different perspective. As we saw yesterday, tribal objects that were devalued under imperialism, plundered by mercenaries, demonized by missionaries, were transvaluated only in the 1890s with the happenstance, the fortune, whereby Felix von Lucian acquired items from Britain's punitive expedition on Benin. In other words, it was never predetermined that avant-garde artists in Paris would chance upon such items, any more than African Americans were predetermined to embrace African art as if greeting long-lost relatives in a homecoming. For a pragmatist who understood value not as an innate quality, but as the precarious outcome of acts of valuation that are always susceptible to variation and revision, the transvaluation of the Dan mask, for example, that we see on page 212, was never written in the stars, but it came about precisely as a result of the unforeseeable contingencies of history. The title of the Negro in Art's third section, The Ancestral Arts, is somewhat misleading, because after 13 pages of African art, the book closes with 2 pages of European modernism, featuring photo reproductions of works by Jacques Lipchitz, Modigliani, Picasso, and Max Weber. Curating the page so that Afro and modern are co-present to one another, the culmination of the story that he was telling in 1940 reveals that Afro-Modernism was made in the break. Instead of the seamless continuity by which an art historian such as Winkelmann, for example, posited an evolutionary line from Greco-Roman origins to 18th century Europe, it is the genesis of something new, something composite, something hybrid, arising out of the jagged edges of violent discontinuity that is at the heart of the cross-cultural historiography being mapped out in Locke's picture book. And the very method by which Locke assembled his materials speaks of a collage-like procedure in which elements selected and combined from disparate sources and multiple origins give rise to a work that is itself composite, and a work that could never have been predicted in any of its antecedent traditions. So the handwritten inscription on the back of the photograph indicates that its source was Paul Guillaume's Paris gallery, which Locke had visited many times. Yet far from acquiescing to the meanings that were assigned to tribal objects, such as the Dan mask by modernist primitivism, these were the meanings confirmed by the formalist valuations that rose to dominance by the end of the 1920s. Locke himself was ripping the image out of that discursive paradigm, altering the very meaning of Africa by reinserting it into a signifying chain of his own devising. Indeed, there is no longer any originary Africa on which all interpretations might agree. For the collage-like act of lifting a found element out of one place and transposing it to another indicates that Africa is always already thrust into quotation marks. This is an Africa that generates meaning as a multi-accentual signifier, producing what Locke called divergent value contrasts in such different discourses as primitivism and ancestralism. So to the extent that collage-like procedures acknowledge historical conditions of contingency, of fortune and chance, departing from evolutionisms and determinisms of any sort, we need to notice that in the Negro in art, Locke is not restoring the uprooted artifact to its place of ethnic origin, but rather he's underscoring the cross-cultural contingency that brought Afro and modern into a shared space of articulation only between the 1890s and the 1910s, all of which serves to render the birth of modernism as a world historical phenomena that's now being rendered intelligible from a new Negro point of view. So at the start of this project, when I received the fabulous intervention to present these talks, I thought of Locke's use of photo reproduction in light of Aby Warburg's Mnemosyne Atlas, in which images from books, postcards, and other photo reproducible sources are arranged collage-like on large panels as part of Warburg's working method of art historical investigation. He sought to bring out trans-chronological patterns amongst motifs that were invested with potent emotive force. For example, the pathos formel that he found in plastic forms such as drapery or flowing hair. And Warburg, more so than an art historian like Winkelmann, is someone who's interested in the breaks and discontinuities, whereby forms that seem to have died in one civilization may enjoy an afterlife in other contexts. And so this is what led him to interpret the Italian Renaissance not as the revival of Greco-Roman origins, but as the afterlife of antiquity, the moment elements from the past gain a new life and undergo metamorphosis. So I think of the Dan mask now, to go back to it here, in its photographic form, as manifesting a Nachleben. This is photo reproduction that is enabling the afterlife of the African art object. We're looking at an ancestral ghost, and I think the way in which the ink is coming through the photographic print heightens that evanescent ghostliness. We're looking at an ancestral ghost whose presence in the medium of photo reproducibility is what enables Afro-diasporic rebirth. So the Nachleben idea is one I think is still worth pursuing, although I think the link to Warburg does not quite capture the cross-cultural space of hybridity that was foremost in the way that Locke collaged Afro and modern. And as we get to the last page of the book, we see how he did it. He paired Picasso's Dancer of Avignon of 1906 with a Cota reliquary figure from the Gabon, and placing them atop reproductions of the Modigliani and the Max Weber that we see at the bottom. And in doing so, the very last page of The Negro in Art sees Locke perform Afro-modern epistemology with a flourish. At first glance, the pairing seems to be based on morphological similarities, similarities between the rhomboid shape of the dancer's legs, right? They're sort of splayed out here, and a similar form that we see on the part of the Cota reliquary figure. But Locke could not possibly have been upholding a purely morphological, a purely formal view along the lines of a Roger Fry, since every single page that has come before this last page has created a hermeneutic context that is avowedly historical and not formalist at all. In its own right, the carving from the Gabon was never a standalone sculptural object, but a guardian figure watching over the relics of deceased ancestors placed in woven caskets from which such carvings were ripped away by the soldiers, the mercenaries, the missionaries, and so on. The pairing of African and modern that gives birth to something new in art, as Locke enables us to understand it in his book, is therefore haunted by a scene of death. There is a hauntedness inscribed in the afterwardsness by which ancestral icons return in the form of photo reproductions. Yet instead of a tragic story that narrates only loss, in which orphaned African artifacts are somehow forever exiled from their origins, there is in fact an element of futurity that's built into the way Locke pairs the Afro-Cota figure with the modern Picasso dancer, by virtue of their placement in the book's closing pages, as if to imply that further juxtapositions may yet arise from the unforeseeable contingencies of cross-cultural contact. So for his part, Warburg proposed an anachronic point of view for the art historian on the basis of his collage-like experiments. He wanted the investigator to be able to look backwards, no, that's the wrong way, to look backwards and forwards at the same time, a Janus-like ability to look both ways. But I suggest that Locke does something similar. He does something similarly double-facing in the light touch that's conveyed by this playful pairing at the book's end. It's as if he's improvising in the coda. That parts company very clearly from evolutionary, deterministic, and teleological art historical narratives by leaving the story open-ended and thus future-forward. So by virtue of his use of photomechanical reproducibility as a medium of art historical inquiry, the Negro in art operates on a shared plane with the Mnemosyne Atlas, as I've just been discussing, although now I think the more apt link would be with André Malraux's Museum Without Walls. Like Locke, Malraux was not an art historian, He wasn't a specialist, but a generalist. But as the creative director at Gallimard Publishing House in Paris, Malraux had access to a vast range of sources that the associates in Negro folk education did not. Be that as it may, the comparison brings us back to the premise that art is structured like a language. Malraux introduced his idea of the imaginary museum that exists in virtual space, in conceptual space, as opposed to physical space, in the first part of his trilogy, Psychology of Art, that was published in Geneva between 47 and 50. And this was followed by the publication between 52 and 54 by Gallimard of Malraux's second trilogy, which was The Imaginary Museum and World Sculpture. And it's pages from volume 2 of this second publication series that we see spread on the floor in the well-known photograph that Maurice Jarnoux took for a Paris Match story that celebrated Malraux, the forward-looking public intellectual who had become, by this stage, part of officialdom. He was Minister of Culture appointed by de Gaulle. But the important point here is the one that Rosalind Kaus draws out in her commentary on Malraux, which is that photo reproduction decontextualizes the work of art twice over. First of all, by removing the art object from its original site of exhibition and display, and secondly, by removing us as viewers from the sensory qualities of the material art object. Yet, decontextualization is only one side of the equation, since what we gain, this is Krauss's argument about what was innovative and important about Malraux, what we gain at the same time that the materiality of the object and its intended context is lost, is the ability to make comparisons among heterogeneous objects from disparate times and places. Such comparisons facilitate an understanding of style as the common language of art from all periods and all cultures. Or, as Krauss put it, quote, the function of comparison organized the understanding of art within the model of language. Each artistic form had something to say and its own language, dialect, idiom with which to say it. Within art historical practices, these linguistic branches then become known as style. So what matters here is Krauss's point that the imaginary museum shifts the focus of inquiry away from the importance of beauty, which is the object of interest to the aesthetician, the connoisseur, towards the view that it's the production of meaning that is now the art historian's primary object of interest. So to continue from Krauss's 1986 essay, quote, with meaning now the master model, having supplanted beauty, all the arts, high and low, east and west, court and folk, begin to find a place in the museum. And her emphasis on language, dialect, and idiom that each artistic form enjoys is underlined when she makes the point that, quote, within art historical practices, these linguistic branches then become known as what is then become known as style. So, like Locke, Malraux seized upon the possibilities offered by the printed page to curate juxtapositions, pairings, and sequencing that would be otherwise impossible or extremely costly with actual artworks themselves. In Malraux's picture books, the preponderance of layouts arguing for stylistic kinship on the basis of morphological sameness raises the question of whether Malraux ultimately relied on a West-centric humanism that would ultimately subsume the incommensurabilities of cultural difference into a universalizing world picture that would ultimately confirm canonical narratives. And commissioning the British photographer who had been associated with surrealism in the 1930s, Roger Parry, Malraux commissioned Parry to illuminate sculptures from dramatic angles. And that was very much part of his formalizing drive in his argument, as Walter Goskramp and others suggest. Although for our purpose, this serves mainly to confirm the point that Locke, for his part, was not invested in formalist narratives so much as a social history of art that in terms of language, dialect, and idiom would be composed of multiple cultural identities. So for his part, Locke was not quoting Malraux for the simple reason that The Negro in Art was published 7 years before Volume 1 of the Psychology of Art in 1947, which was only translated into English in 1949 as The Voices of Silence. Furthermore, despite the fact that Locke and Malraux wrote for a public readership as generalists rather than as academic specialists, Locke remained loyal to the idea of beauty, even as the mid-century moment of the 1940s brought about the democratizing transformations that Locke addressed not so much in his cultural criticism, but rather in his social science writings, writings that informed the 1942 issue of Survey Graphic that he guest edited on Colour, the Unfinished Business of Democracy, as well as the When Peoples Meet anthology. And in this regard, there is another difference between Locke and Malraux that I think is equally suggestive. Whereas Malraux was aware of Walter Benjamin's 1936 essay on photo-reproducibility and underplayed the connection, Locke, for all his Germanophilia, rarely engaged with Marxism. But when Benjamin argued for the democratizing potential of photo-reproduction, which for him meant dismantling the canonical aura of the art historical masterpiece, and in relation to which he also argued that the photographic medium would generate revolutionary forms of self-representation amongst the popular classes, I find it fascinating to observe that a million miles away in Washington, D.C., Locke was actually acting on Benjamin's insights, democratizing art history in a picture book put together from an African-American point of view. Locke's Howard archives contain commercial illustrations reproduced in the Negro in Art in 1942. That's in one box. Although I particularly like the official verb in the wording of box 223, which is illustrations removed from magazines and catalogues. This is far less abrasive than saying appropriated, which is what he actually did. We can see that he's literally ripped out these pages from other reproductions, and they have his commentary to the printers. To notice that the photograph of the Cota reliquary figure is literally ripped out of a French catalogue, and the image of the Kasai cup, the box, and the ceremonial drinking cup, likewise torn out of a German catalogue, is to restate the case that Locke built up the argumentation that he put together in his layouts and in the sequencing of the Negro in Art on the basis of a collage-like epistemology. And this was enacted in the Negro in Art, not in the name of establishing an African-American canon or in the name of revolutionary upheaval, as Benjamin wanted photo reproduction to be, but in the name of a diasporic cosmopolitanism, in which the threefold sequencing of African-American art, Western art history, and then African art and European modernism told a story of world art history that had now been accentuated, idiomatized, if one could use that word, from a new Negro point of view. So under the watchful eyes of the Benin flute player, circa 1550, whose page was similarly ripped out of a catalogue of African art in British collections, and this we see on the reverse side with Locke's instructions giving directions to the photoreprographic team, I want to end by suggesting that the huge problems that there are in Locke's cultural criticism, his avoidance of conflict, his idealistic indifference to material inequalities, his lack of attention to structural asymmetries, problems that I will address tomorrow in the final lecture, that these problems are nonetheless cast into an altered light when we consider the pragmatist precepts that connect his writings on art and culture with his philosophical outlook as a theorist of culture and society more broadly. Ripping photographs out of one context, cutting them away from the discourses that sought to fix their meaning, and then selecting and combining them so as to build in virtual space an imaginary museum made of appropriated or even stolen images, because let's put the whole question of rights and permissions to one side, as would be logical for anyone who had an anti-proprietorial view of culture. Once we take all this into account, I think we see an intellectually modernist thinker who in 1940 stayed true to the critical ambitions that he first voiced in his 1916 lectures, when as an assistant professor, he set out to persuade his Howard University audience along the following lines. So we're jumping back to 1916 now. Race as a unit of social thought is of permanent significance and of growing importance. Too much social thinking has gone into it for it to be abandoned as a center of thought or of practice. To redeem, to rescue, or to revise that thought and practice should be the aim of race theorists and those who want to educate people into better channels of group living, end quote. So to redeem, to rescue, or to revise, these are the words of a critical pragmatist, best redescribed, as Richard Rorty would put it, as arguing that this unit, this category of race, is functioning like a signifier. As a unit or category that forges group solidarity and collective identity, race cannot be abandoned, Locke is arguing, but must be re-signified towards the goal of democratic transformation. In contrast to those who argue that social change comes about first from the determining realms of politics or the economy, Locke concluded by asserting the primacy of culture in the following way. Quote, and again, we're in 1916, a final word about what is really the goal of race progress and race adjustment. The thing which it must promote, if the concept of social race is to prevail, is culture citizenship. Culture citizenship must come in terms of group contribution to what becomes a joint civilization, end quote. And as Nancy Fraser summarizes, in Race Contacts and Interracial Relations, Locke was arguing that, quote, Negroes should therefore pursue cultural citizenship, both to forge solidarity amongst themselves and to win respect from Anglo-America. This is Nancy Fraser's voice. By making their own distinctive contribution to the emerging joint civilization, they will eventually win full citizenship. And she adds, here we begin to recognize the future Alain Locke of the Harlem Renaissance. But that Alain Locke now looks somewhat different. The new Negro project appears to be a bid for culture citizenship as a step on the way to political and economic citizenship. Locke's mature cultural nationalism thus appears as a strategy aimed at overcoming a form of racial domination that he understood as ultimately economical and political. Its roots lie in a sophisticated pragmatist understanding of race conjoined with an anti-imperialist political analysis. End quote. So tomorrow I'm going to pick up on some of the more problematic aspects of Fraser's conception of the relationship between culture and politics by showing the advantages that we gain from redescribing Locke's pragmatism in terms of a discursive constructionism. But for now, the continuum that I've outlined in this lecture, the continuum between the world-minded outlook we find within the Negro in art and the view of culture and society that turns on race as a unit of social thought that can be redeemed, rescued, and revised, is all best summed up in a line from Locke's 1935 article, Values and Imperatives. In this article, Locke is indicating his distance from foundationalist thinking that aspires to timeless truth by starting from first principles in a top-down logic that wants reality to be subservient to abstract and transcendental values. On the contrary, Locke said that, quote, all philosophies, it seems to me, are in ultimate derivation philosophies of life and not of abstract, disembodied, objective reality. They are products of time, place, and situation, and thus systems of timed history rather than timeless eternity, end quote. And I think for us, the Negro in art encapsulates one such system of timed history in its innovative use of layouts and in curating the page on photo reproductions to produce an Afro-modern narrative of art history from a critically black pluralist standpoint. So Locke is often portrayed as a cultural critic whose high-mindedness in all manners of aesthetics meant that he related to artists as though he were their tutor. I'll come on to the mural in a moment. As if he were judging the work so as to discipline each generation in accord with his precepts. And such a view, which is commonplace in the literature, is misleading on at least two accounts. In contrast to the top-down criteria that Du Bois imposed on the products of culture in a deductive approach that paid little attention to actual artworks themselves, because they rarely lived up to the abstract ideals that he had decided they should embody in advance. In contrast to this, Locke's intellectual leadership had everything to do with the inferential logic by which he paid close attention to what was painted on the canvas, what was sculpted in the stone, as the basis on which to then differentiate plural directions from the bottom up. And in this way, culture serves as an index of ever-growing differentiations in blackness and black life. Throughout his cultural criticism, Locke was committed to making aesthetic judgment. And that was not because he set himself up as an authority figure, although passing judgment was most certainly what he did, but because as a pragmatist, seeking to modify his circumstances of time, place, and situation, he believed that judging the culture was how you build the culture. A culture cannot grow when everybody agrees. Principled criticism is the medium in which critical black pluralism builds room for future growth by closely attending to differentiations and emerging potentials and the emerging potentials they suggest when they make their presence felt first, culturally. In any event, it was not just that artists such as Alston and Bearden had already internalized the lessons of the 1920s with regard to African art, even as they distanced themselves from what Locke stood for, but that African-American artists of the post-Harlem generation, such as Hale Woodruff, were fully attuned to the world-mindedness that consistently stood behind Locke's cultural criticism. So Woodruff's Art of the Negro mural complements Locke's viewpoint in the Negro in art. Woodruff's 6 murals on the mezzanine of the Trevor Arnott Library at the Clark Atlanta University render a world historical narrative of cross-cultural contact. This is an installation view that shows how it works architecturally, even though it starts with native forms and then it concludes, as it comes around, with influences and artists. So beginning with native forms above the library entrance, which depicts San cave painters and tribal shields, the second mural, which we can't see, Interchange, depicts Egyptian, Greco-Roman, and East Asian architectural forms, before the third, which is entitled Dissipation, evokes moments of iconoclasm, such as the Protestant Revolution, but also the plunder of Benin artifacts in 1897. So where the fourth panel, which is called Parallels, places pre-Columbian, Native American, and oceanic motifs alongside African forms, that then segues into influences, which, as we can see, intermingles pre-modern sources amongst 20th century artists such as Henry Moore, alongside Haitian Veve inscriptions. We can see that in this section of the panel. The program concludes with Artists, which places generations of Afro-Diaspora artists under the aegis of 2 muses that signify the cross-cultural entanglement of Greek antiquity and ancient Africa. So Shango's double-headed axe, this is up here, which is obviously repeated in the inscription on the glass door, is as emblematically important as the Bembe figure who holds it. And it was completely by chance, it was completely by good fortune that Woodruff bumped into Locke during a visit to Paris in 1927, whereupon Locke, quote, took him to a flea market where, for $2, Woodruff bought a small but beautiful Bembe ancestral fetish figure from the Congo. This is according to Bearden and Henderson's History of African American Artists. And it is, for us, an incident that reminds us of the sheer contingency, the happenstance by which Afro and modern arose in the break, in unforeseeable encounters that gave rise to something new. So Woodruff taught at Atlanta University from 1931 onwards, but he painted the murals in New York, which was his base from 46 to 67. This was the base from which, as a professor of art at NYU, he helped to organize the artist sessions at Studio 35 in 1950, and the place from which he, Alston, Bearden, and others formed the Spiral Group later in 1964. So as Woodruff moved between figurative and abstract painting, his mid-century trajectory not only scrambles the binary that assumes universal and particular are innate and ahistorical attributes, but his Art of the Negro murals demonstrate that Woodruff saw his place in art history from a world historical standpoint. The 2 muses, embodying Africa and Greece, indeed form a binary pair. But what the artwork is showing us by placing Afro-diasporic art history in the final mural, not as a self-contained field, but as the inscription of an ongoing story of cross-cultural interchange, is that Africa and Europe preside over a caste of progeny. We can see Tanner, who's third from the right, and we see Charles Alston holding up one of his carvings, and we also see Richmond Barthé, and that's Blackberry Woman, sculpture from 1930s. These two muses representing Africa and Greece are presiding over a caste of progeny who've been irrevocably hybridized by cross-cultural contact, a caste of players in a game that is as irreversibly composite as the modern works of art that they've created. Thanks.
Thanks, Kobe. That man, that's going to be such a great book. Such fabulous lecture. So I'm enjoying every second. Where is the Nancy Fraser quote from and when?
That's her contribution to the critical pragmatism of Alain Locke that Leonard Harris edited. That came out in '99.
Oh, so she's just summarizing what he said. I'm sorry. I thought that it was a quote before the Harlem Renaissance. No.
No, what Nancy Fraser has given us, which was really innovative and very valuable in that contribution, was a reading of the lectures, Race, Contacts and Interracial Relations, that Jeffrey Stewart had made available in 1980, earlier.
Right. In his anthology of Locke's writings.
Well, as a standalone work that's published by Howard University Press.
Oh, okay.
So
that was the lectures that Locke gave in 1916, or?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
5 lectures. A real labor of love, an invaluable primary source. But my view is that Nancy Fraser's interpretation had really got to the heart of it in terms of bringing out this anti-imperialist outlook that he had in moving from biological race to social race. Mm-hmm. And then the most exciting part being this emphasis that we can't abandon this unit of social thought because too much has been invested into it. We have to repurpose it. And that, to me, suggests a very dynamic, a very forward-looking way of thinking about culture as a composite formation.
Good, thank you. I'll see you dinner. Right there.
I'm sorry.
That's a question at the back, yeah.
So I thinking about yesterday when you mentioned Locke as an institution builder as well, and so you mentioned the Harlem Museum of African Art that goes unrealized, and so then we kind of think about African art in the Encyclopedic Museum, and then today I'm thinking of when you talk about the Negro in art as going from 1700s to 1930s, and then ending with African art and Euro-modernism. So I'm wondering if you think about kind of like a structure of an encyclopedic exam, and I think, encyclopedic museum, and how folks today are thinking about, what does a museum look like that's kind of either using race as a structuring principle or just structuring a history of art that, I don't even want to say starts with African art, but that kind of privileges, I guess, Black people in some kind of way. Like I think of the Charles H. Wright Museum in Detroit, or even like the new museum in DC. I'm wondering, what are some of the legacies of the ways Locke is working that has carried over into institutions and like kind of Black museums, yes, as cultural institutions, but also as ones that are wanting to be about art in some kind of way and structuring it differently?
Okay, great question. For me, the most exciting part about his imaginary museum is that it exists in virtual space. And I think we could literalize that in terms of what would a digitized realization or a digitized reiteration of this book look like. The exciting thing about his conception of virtual space is that it's open-ended. When we enter a bricks and mortar museum, we're often guided by a floor plan that's based on a narrative. So you start at the beginning, the earliest period, you move your way through, and you come out at the end before you get to the gift shop, at the contemporary, at the present. And in 1940, we have a thinker who's left that to one side. He's not signed up to the idea of an origin that's going to determine everything. He's not signed up to an evolutionist or developmentalist plan, which means that you must start here in order to get there. He's left things open-ended. And I was getting at this in terms of a collage-like epistemology. But I think, I mean, the short and simple answer is that I don't know whether the two institutions that you just mentioned have been paying enough attention to what was put on offer. I think the book has been dismissed as just a picture book. You know, it was produced by an organization that was seeking to produce materials for adult education. That was true for the bronze booklets as well. So my purpose in these lectures, in this series, has been to read Locke closely. And I think the pragmatist lens serves in that regard, but I think it's never too late to go back and get it. I think the institution, and we have a very large one in Washington, D.C., in terms of, you know, the Museum of African American National History and Culture. We have a lot to learn from this very forward-thinking, experimental thinking, and perhaps we don't see that aspect of Locke when we look in a more narrow way at the problems of his elitism and so on.
Thank you, Kobena, for that lecture. Very interesting, really interesting to hear the continuation, because it's, I mean, I'm still curious about tomorrow as well. But you're opening up so many aspects that I'm really curious to learn more about. I like how you retrieve material, and especially the notion of a picture book that would be dismissed. I think that so much that's coming out of this is from your interpretation, definitely, and you're weaving together of a number of parts that haven't been woven together before. And I'm curious about how you came to Locke in the first place. I'm curious about your own interest, what's compelled you to probe Locke, who's, I mean, we talked about it before, that, I mean, in my view, I was so interested in the artist's view of Locke, for example, and so this is a whole other dimension, the pragmatist aspect, all of these other parts. So if you could just say something about that, that'd be nice.
Okay, yeah, definitely. I mean, picture book, you know, when I was a teenager, I read John Berger's Ways of Seeing, and I loved it. I love photo reproductions that are next to text. I like photo text and image text works. And that, to me, it's not that it was more exciting than going to Tate Gallery or going to the British Museum. That was great too. But there was something about the portability of a book. In a curious way, there is a kind of proprietorial element that you can own the story. It's a paperback. You can open and close it and go back to it. And so that's one way of, I think I want to retrieve the idea of a picture book as something that is worthy of investigation. It's too easy to dismiss it as something that's only of interest to bored teenagers or adult education and so on. And that's why I think that, you know, looking at you know, Walter Goscramp's book on Malraux is really important in terms of looking at who came before Voices of Silence, in terms of using the page as a platform for making connections across time, place, and across cultures. And I think that Locke fits full square in that moment. This is the 1940s when so many things are being literally turned upside down. But that's a connection. I mean, I doubt whether we would be able to connect Locke and Malraux if we locked him down, literally, as the aesthete of the 1920s only. And I think his philosophical background, which Jeffrey Stewart has done so much to kind of bring to life and to show how it infuses all aspects of his cultural criticism, is really the missing ingredient. But the second part of your question, I came to Locke because I came to African American art history through work that I was doing in contemporary criticism around Black British artists in the 1980s. And it was when I started to teach African American art history that I was using the Negro in art for its biographical information about the 19th century artists, the early 20th century artists. It was instantly retrievable in terms of you had to dig it out. Of the only available surveys at this time were Samela Lewis's book, of, was it 1979? Art 70s. You know, we're so much luckier since we have Richard Powell's survey, Black Art and Culture in the 20th Century, 1997, and Sharon Patton's indispensable African American art history. But when I started at UC Santa Cruz in 1990, going back to those texts of the 1970s, it was actually more serviceable to make a leap even further back in time and to work with Locke's thinking. So that, in a sense, was my point of entry, which may not, it was certainly not the same as thinking from the point of view of the artists themselves.
I like that a lot. I mean, I think, I guess, when I say the artist, because of talking, or hearing them, like Bearded or, someone like that, and comparing, like, what kinds of things they would have said from that earlier period to the more contemporary things they may have said. So, no, I like that going back even further than 20 years.
Thank you so much for this incredible, rich lecture. I was very fascinated about your analysis of the final page of the Negro in art and what he was doing there with those moves as a kind of prophecy or towards a kind of future-directed, as you said, diaspora cosmopolitanism. And it reminded me of the final entry in the New Negro, which is Du Bois's Worlds of Color, which also seems to point in this, he repeats his old phrase, the problem of the 20th century is going to be a problem of the color line, and seems to have this future-directed, prophetic pronunciation about a kind of more international, global-minded set of interests for some of these issues. And I was wondering if you had noticed this kind of a pattern in Locke's editorial practice as a kind of the final move I will inscribe, as an editor or a curator, is going to have this quality of this kind of prophetic, future-directed option, or if that's, not that.
No, thank you for that. I hadn't thought about that connection, and I think it would be worth pursuing. Yes, both that anthology of 1925 and the picture book of 1940 end on this very future-forward, open-ended note. And I think, if anything we've learned from post-structuralism and deconstructing, keeping things open-ending is not an easy task. It requires discipline, because we get a lot of comfort. We get the illusion of self-certainty from closure. Aha, I've got it. I know it. I found the answer. Therefore, I pass the exam. Therefore, I get the job. Therefore, I move forward. And so the logic that enables you to keep your anthology open-ended, to keep your thinking open-ended, is no small feat. And I think that needs to be set in context with the major problems that there are in the cultural criticism as well. So what comes to mind when you think about locating Locke in a tradition of prophetic thought would be the relationship that Nancy Fraser's article, I know that Skip has left the building, but the relationship that Nancy Fraser has to Cornel West's The Pragmatist Evasion of Philosophy, where West talks about Du Bois as a pragmatist thinker. So I think that could be one step to take to explore the connection that you're making. But yeah, there's another way of coming at it too. I mean, in their biography, Charles Molesworth and Leonard Harris repeatedly draw our attention to the optative mode in which Locke wrote. So he wrote hopefully. He wrote optatively in terms of anticipating what's going to come next. And we touched on this yesterday when he said in 1925 that anthropologists don't know enough about art in Africa for us to say what it means culturally, and to counterbalance that against what the formalists are admiring in its formal beauty. And I think there's something undecidable about this optative hopefulness. On the one hand, you could say this is wishful thinking in extreme. I hope this will happen, but have I done the fact-checking? Have I done the background to have any kind of predictive or anticipatory sense? But at the same time, I think that's an important part of what keeps it open-ended. And what protects Locke's thinking and keeps it fresh is this sidestepping away from that determinism. which is, I think, the kind of the masculinized version of the prophetic tradition. I don't think he identifies that. I think he disidentifies with that. And yeah, I'll be talking about his disidentifications as a queer man, as a black gay intellectual tomorrow.
Well, we all want to thank you for just an extraordinary second day of lectures. We all want to come back to hear more tomorrow. We have refreshments here, and I now invite us all to speak with Kobena informally and thank him now for this extraordinary talk.
Thank you.